The war in Ukraine has already reshaped the global order in ways few conflicts ever have. What began as a regional invasion has evolved into a defining geopolitical struggle between Russia and the Western alliance. Now, as discussions around a future ceasefire quietly surface in diplomatic backchannels, a far more dangerous warning has emerged. Europe and the United States are signaling that if Russia violates any future ceasefire agreement, the response may no longer remain limited to sanctions, weapons shipments, or indirect pressure. This time, the response could be military. This warning is not made lightly. For more than 2 years, Western powers have carefully avoided direct confrontation with Russia, a nuclear-armed state. Every step has been calculated, debated, and often delayed out of fear of escalation. But patience in Washington, Brussels, and several European capitals is wearing thin. The message forming behind closed doors is clear. A ceasefire that is broken deliberately will not be treated as a misunderstanding, a technical violation, or another gray zone tactic. It will be seen as an act of bad faith, and potentially as an act of aggression that demands a stronger response. The idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine itself is complex and fragile. Unlike traditional wars where front lines are clear and negotiations follow decisive victories, this conflict exists in a constant state of tension. Russian forces occupy large portions of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine insists on full territorial integrity. Russia demands security guarantees and recognition of territorial changes. Western allies insist that any ceasefire must respect international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. These positions are fundamentally incompatible, which makes any future ceasefire extremely unstable from the start. Yet even unstable ceasefires can serve a purpose. They can reduce civilian suffering, slow the destruction of infrastructure, and create space for diplomacy. However, history has taught Europe and the United States a hard lesson. Russia has repeatedly used ceasefires as tactical pauses rather than genuine steps toward peace. From Georgia in 2008 to Crimea and eastern Ukraine after 2014, ceasefires were often followed by renewed offensives once conditions became favorable for Moscow. This historical pattern is shaping current Western thinking. Officials increasingly argue that a ceasefire without enforcement mechanisms is meaningless. A ceasefire without consequences is an invitation to abuse. And a ceasefire that allows Russia to regroup, rearm, and reposition forces could make the next phase of the war even more devastating than the last. That is why the language coming from Western leaders has grown sharper. When European and American officials speak of a possible military response, they are not necessarily talking about full-scale war with Russia. Instead, they are signaling a shift away from absolute restraint. The goal is deterrence. The message is meant to be understood clearly in Moscow. If you agree to a ceasefire and then break it, the rules of engagement change. This shift reflects a deeper transformation in how the West views the conflict. In the early stages of the war, there was hope that Russia could be pressured into negotiation through economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation. Those tools have inflicted real damage on the Russian economy, but they have not altered the Kremlin's core strategic objectives. The war continues, casualties mount, and the front lines remain volatile. Meanwhile, Ukraine has become one of the most militarized countries in the world. Its army is battle-hardened, its society is mobilized, and its survival is tied directly to Western support. For European leaders, the war is no longer a distant crisis. It is happening on their continent, threatening regional stability, energy security, and the credibility of international law. For the United States, the conflict is a test of global leadership and deterrence, watched closely by allies and rivals alike. China, Iran, North Korea, and other actors are studying how the West responds. If Russia can violate agreements without serious consequences, message to the VULNE, our world, is BLE dangerous. It suggests that power outweighs law and that nuclear-armed states can act with impunity. This fear is driving the harder line now emerging in Western policy circles. What would a military response actually look like? This is where ambiguity becomes a strategic tool. Western leaders are deliberately vague, and that vagueness is intentional. It forces Russian planners to consider multiple scenarios, increasing uncertainty and risk. A military response does not necessarily mean NATO troops marching into Ukraine. It could involve limited strikes on Russian military assets used to violate the ceasefire. It could mean the establishment of a no-fly zone over certain areas. It could involve direct protection of Ukrainian infrastructure or the deployment of international forces along agreed lines. Another possibility is the transformation of Ukraine's defense relationship with the West. A ceasefire violation could trigger immediate security guarantees, accelerated NATO integration, or the permanent stationing of Western forces in Ukraine in a defensive role. These steps would dramatically alter the strategic balance and represent a red line for Moscow. The West understands that any military action carries enormous risks. Russia would frame it as proof that NATO is at war with Russia. Escalation dynamics could spiral quickly. Cyber attacks, sabotage, and hybrid warfare would likely intensify. Energy infrastructure, undersea cables, and satellite systems could become targets. The shadow of nuclear escalation would loom larger than at any time since the Cold War. Despite these dangers, Western leaders appear increasingly convinced that doing nothing is even riskier. A ceasefire that collapses without consequence would embolden Russia and weaken the entire system of international agreements. It would also undermine Ukraine's faith in its allies and could fracture Western unity. European unity is especially critical here. Countries closer to Russia, particularly in Eastern Europe, have long warned that Moscow only respects strength. Poland, the Baltic states, and others argue that half measures invite aggression. Western Europe, traditionally more cautious, is slowly moving closer to this view as the war drags on, and Russian rhetoric grows more confrontational. Public opinion is also shifting. While war fatigue exists, especially as economic pressures rise, there is also growing anger at the idea of endless cycles of violence fueled by broken promises. Many citizens now see enforcement as the only path to lasting peace. A ceasefire must mean something, or it means nothing at all. From Russia's perspective, the warnings from Europe and the United States are seen as both a threat and a challenge. Russian officials portray Western statements as aggressive posturing designed to intimidate Moscow. State media frames the war as a defensive struggle against Western expansion and interference. Any suggestion of Western military involvement is used to justify further mobilization and repression at home. However, behind the propaganda, Russian strategists are calculating carefully. The Russian military has suffered significant losses. Equipment shortages, manpower issues, and economic strain are real. A direct military confrontation with the combined power of NATO would be catastrophic for Russia. This reality gives weight to Western deterrence efforts. Still, deterrence only works if it is credible. That is why Western leaders are increasingly backing words with actions. Military exercises near NATO's eastern flank have intensified. Arms deliveries to Ukraine have become more advanced and more rapid. Intelligence sharing has deepened. These steps are meant to show that the West is prepared, not just rhetorically, but operationally. The future of a ceasefire, if one is reached at all, will depend on trust, verification, and enforcement. International monitoring missions, satellite surveillance, and real-time intelligence will be crucial. Any violation will be detected quickly. The era of plausible deniability is fading. At the same time, diplomatic channels remain open. Even as warnings grow sharper, back-channel communication continues. The goal is not war, but prevention. The threat of a military response is meant to make war less likely, not more. It is a paradox at the heart of deterrence. Peace is preserved not by goodwill alone, but by the fear of consequences. For Ukraine, these developments are both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because they suggest that the world will not abandon Ukraine to another frozen conflict. Terrifying because escalation could turn Ukraine into the front line of a much larger war. Ukrainian leaders must balance their desire for security with the reality of living under constant threat. The coming months will be decisive. If a ceasefire is proposed, its terms will be scrutinized intensely. Every word, every condition, every enforcement mechanism will matter. Europe and the United States appear determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. They want a ceasefire that holds, or at least one that carries real consequences if it fails. The world is watching closely. What happens in Ukraine will shape the future of international security for decades. It will determine whether agreements are respected or exploited, whether power overrides law, and whether deterrence still works in a nuclear age. If Russia honors a future ceasefire, it could open the door to de-escalation, reconstruction, and a fragile but meaningful peace process. If Russia violates it, the response may mark a turning point not just in this war, but in the global balance of power. The warning from Europe and the United States is unmistakable. This time, the cost of breaking the peace may be far higher than ever before.